Good morning, students. Welcome to history class. Today, we are going to read Egyptian civilizations. You must have heard the name of Egypt. This name certainly reminds you of the pyramids. Let us now look into the ancient history of Egypt, which was one of the places where human civilization first began. Ancient Egypt is the land of mysteries. The civilization of ancient Egypt is known for its stupendous achievements in whole range of fields, including arts and architecture, engineering, medicine, and statecraft. In the continent of Africa, the country on both sides of the river Nile is called Egypt. Evidences of human habitation in Egypt stretches back tens of thousands of years. It was only in about 6000 BCE, however, that widespread settlement began in the region. Around this time, the Sahara Desert expanded. The most important result of this expansion of the Sahara Desert for human civilization was that it pushed humans closer to the Nile River in search of reliable water source. And this Nile River is the lifeline of Egypt. Egyptian civilization sometimes is regarded as the gift of Nile. The river Nile is the life-giving river of Egypt. Its contribution to the birth and development of Egyptian civilization is very great indeed. Apart from the delta region where the river spreads out as it flows into the sea, most settlement in the Nile Valley was confined to within a few miles of the river itself. The Nile River flooded annually. This flooding was so regular that the ancient Egyptians said there three seasons: inundation, which is also called flooding, growth, and harvest around this Nile River. This annual flooding was vital to agriculture because it deposited a new layer of nutrient rich soil each year. The river Nile is the lifeblood of Egypt, and the season of inundation, that is flood, is the most important time of the year. Without this constant supply of water, Egypt would become a desert. On the west of Egypt is situated the Sahara Desert. The climate of Egypt is therefore dry and hot, but the banks of Nile, however, have a different climate. Both the banks of the river are flooded every year by the water of the Nile. This makes the two banks fertile. For every year, sleet is deposited on both the banks due to flood. So you can see this is the reason why Nile is called the lifeline, lifeblood of Egypt. Because if you see the picture over here, you can see the maximum portion is desert, and the green portion that you can see is actually this Nile Valley. The river is flowing from this place, and the banks of this river are green. That is, it is so rich soil is present over there that this vegetation is possible. Now, let us get to know something about the Egyptian civilization. In today's discussion, we will learn about the social classes of Egyptian civilization. In his immense scholarly work, The Stories, the Greek scholar Herodotus wrote a book exclusively about Egypt, set in the years between 664 BCE to 525 BCE. The material has been valuable to our modern day understanding of life in everyday Egypt. If you now look at the picture over here, this is a kind of pyramid structure that was present in ancient Egyptian society. At the very highest rung of the social ladder was the pharaoh or the king. Below the king on the social pyramid was the ruling elites, wizard and priests. Below them were scribes. Next, craftsmen and artists or artisans. Next to them were peasants, and in the lowest rung of the social ladder were slaves and servants. Now let us know in detail about them. So in the highest rung of the social ladder were the pharaohs. Now who were the pharaohs? Egyptian kings were called pharaohs. The Egyptians used to call their king pharaoh. The meaning of this expression, that is pharaoh, is one who lived in a big house. The house in which the Egyptian king lived must have been very big. This was the reason why the king of Egypt came to be called by the name Pharaoh. Pharaoh was the all-powerful man in Egypt. All the lands belonged to the Pharaoh, and his word was the law. The Egyptians worshipped the Pharaoh as they looked upon him as the god on earth. As the head of the state, the Pharaoh maintained the law and order and punished the offenders. He also defended the country from aggression of the foreigners. Pharaoh administered the country through chiefs appointed by him. He had many officials, guards, and warriors at his service. Around 3100 BCE, Menes, the ruler of Upper Egypt, established the first Egyptian dynasty. He conquered Lower Egypt and combined the two kingdoms into one. This gave him great amount of power. Memphis became the new Egyptian capital. So, next to the pharaohs were wizards and priests. The Egyptian king Pharaoh had one main advisor. This advisor was called a wizard, who handled all the affairs of the state and was second in command to the Pharaoh himself. He helped the Pharaoh to govern the land, and he was the chief administrator of ancient Egypt. Next to the Pharaoh also came the priests. The Egyptians built houses of gods or temples, and idols were put in them. In each temple there were some people called priests. The Egyptians believed that priests were the servants of God and they could talk with the God. The people in those days also believed that it was through the priests that gods informed people of the divine orders. In order to win favors from God, Egyptians offered presents and made sacrifices to the god. All these sacrifices, however, fell into the hands of the priests, who gradually became a wealthy class in the society. Next to them were scribes, craftsmen, and artisans. The task of recording history, expressing everyday and extraordinary happenings, was the responsibility of the scribe in ancient Egypt. Having the title of scribe was an honorable position for one to hold in Egyptian culture. People viewed the scribes as being spiritual because they had the ability to do something most people didn't understand. But being a scribe was an extremely difficult job because in total there were hundreds of different hieroglyphs to remember. The craftsmen and artists had an easier life. They worked in shops close to the palace of the pharaohs, or on the estate of priests and nobles. The highly skilled smiths forged bronze tools and weapons and made fine copper and bronze dishes for the homes of the rich Egyptians. Goldsmiths and silversmiths also made tableware as well as richly wrought jewelry. Potters produced clay vessels on a hand-turned potter's wheel and then baked them in closed furnaces. The crafts or artistic work during this period did not limit to what examples I gave you just now. They did many other things. Why don't you look into internet resources and find out what are the different types of artistic works or crafts done during this time, during ancient Egyptian civilization. Next in the social ladder were the peasants. The continual labor of the peasants who tilled the soil made possible the luxurious life of the pharaohs and the nobles. After the peasants harvested the crops, the pharaoh could call on them to perform work for the state. They could go off to labor on irrigation, to quarry stones with primitive tools, or to build tombs and temples. After them in the social ladder were slaves. Although slavery was not common in ancient Egypt, some people were kept as slaves. These slaves were generally foreigners or non-Egyptians taken captive in war or traded to the Egyptian. That is, Egyptians bought slaves from other countries. Some slaves worked as domestic servants in households, while others served as agricultural laborers in the field. So that was all for today's discussion. After listening to this video, open your book to page number 34 and start reading section A and section B. You will find this in page number 34 to page number 36. If you have any queries understanding this portion, send me during the class hours at the